In July 1947, a ranch hand outside Roswell, New Mexico, claims he photographed something that should not have existed. Not wreckage from a weather balloon, not debris from a classified military project. Something else. Something with bodies. He had the film, he had the evidence, and within 72 hours before a single frame could be developed, men in uniforms appeared at his door and took it. The question isn't whether the photographs existed. The question is, how did they know he had them? Let me tell you about Earl Hicks, not his background, not his childhood in the Pecos Valley or the years he spent working the Foster Ranch alongside Mac Brazel. What matters is a single morning. July 6th, 1947, a Sunday. The kind of morning in southeastern New Mexico where the sky is so wide and so flat that you feel exposed to the entire universe at once. And for Earl Hicks, on that particular morning, the universe apparently looked back. Hicks had been riding the North Pasture before dawn, routine work checking fence lines after a reported thunderstorm 2 nights prior. What he found wasn't storm damage, not scattered posts, not downed wire, not the ordinary chaos of a desert squall. It was something else entirely, laid across nearly a quarter mile of scrubland, and he described it later in a handwritten account recovered by researchers in 1994 from a storage facility in Amarillo, Texas, as not from any machine I had ever seen or worked on. He had a camera, a Kodak Vigilant 620 folding bellows, the kind of medium format camera that serious amateur photographers used in that era. He had purchased it the previous spring from a shop in Roswell proper, and crucially, he had film already loaded, 12 exposures. He used all of them. What did he photograph? That's the question that pulls you in and refuses to let go. According to his account, and to the corroborating testimony of a second individual, a ranch worker named only as R.D. in the original document, the debris field was unlike anything described in the official record. There were beams, yes, lightweight, metallic seeming. There was material that Hicks called like foil but heavier than it looked, and you couldn't crease it. These details overlap with dozens of other Roswell testimonies, and their repetition across independent accounts is, at minimum, curious. But here's where the account departs from everything we've been told. Hicks photographed bodies, not wreckage, not instrument panels or fragments of something terrestrial. Bodies. Small, pale, arranged on the ground with what he described as a kind of deliberate order, as though they had been placed there after the fact, rather than thrown by impact. He counted 4 of them. 2 appeared intact, 2 did not. He photographed them from multiple angles. He was specific about this in his account, noting that he moved around them, that he was close enough to see the hands which had more fingers than they should. He was shaking. He admitted that, hands trembling so badly he wasn't sure the photographs would come out clearly. But he shot all 12 frames, and he tucked the camera under his arm, and he rode back toward the ranch house as fast as his horse would carry him. He told no one. For approximately 18 hours, Earl Hicks said nothing to anyone about what he had seen. Why? He wasn't sure himself in retrospect. He described it as a kind of paralysis, not fear exactly, but something closer to incomprehension. The human mind, confronted with something genuinely outside its framework, may simply shut down the impulse to communicate. It may quarantine the experience. It may wait. He waited 18 hours. And in that window, that narrow, quiet window, something set a chain of events in motion that has never been satisfactorily explained. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the geography of the situation. The Foster Ranch sits roughly 75 miles north of Roswell, in a region that in 1947 was serviced by a single paved road and a network of dirt tracks that became impassable in wet weather. The nearest telephone was approximately 12 miles from the main ranch house at a neighbouring property. Earl Hicks did not have a vehicle. He did not use that telephone in the 18 hours following his discovery. He told nobody. So when two men in Air Force uniforms appeared at the ranch house at approximately 6 in the morning on July 8th, less than 36 hours after Hicks's discovery and before he had travelled to Roswell to develop the film, the question becomes unavoidable. How did they know? I want to sit with that for a moment, because this is where the official explanation begins to buckle. The standard account of Roswell, the one presented in government documents and repeated in authorised histories, holds that the military response to the debris field was triggered by Mac Brazel's report to Sheriff George Wilcox on July the 7th, and that the subsequent recovery operation was focused entirely on the main debris site. There is no mention of Earl Hicks in any official document, no mention of his camera, no mention of a secondary witness or a secondary location, and yet two men arrived at his door. They asked by name for the camera, not for a camera, for his camera. They knew the model. One of them referenced the folding Kodak, according to Hicks's account. They knew he had been on the North Pasture. They knew he had exposed film. They were polite. He emphasized that repeatedly, almost anxiously, as though the politeness itself was significant. They were very calm and very polite, and they explained it was a matter of national security. He gave them the camera. He gave them the film canister, which he had removed and placed in a shirt pocket. He gave them everything, and then they left. And then for nearly 4 decades, Earl Hicks said nothing to no one about what he had seen. That silence is worth examining. What produces that kind of silence? Fear, certainly. But also, and this is harder to quantify, a sense of futility, a sense that what you know has already been accounted for, that the thing you witnessed has been placed in a box and the box has been sealed, and there is no mechanism available to you for reopening it. The deeper you go into testimonies from the Roswell periphery, the accounts of ranch workers, local residents, amateur observers who were adjacent to the main event without being part of it, the more you encounter this particular quality of silence. Not denial, not confusion, silence that feels deliberate, silence that feels, in some cases, like the aftershock of a warning. Hicks was never explicitly warned. He said that clearly. No threats were made, no documents were signed, or at least he claimed none were signed, though he was uncertain about one moment during the men's visit when he was handed a paper and asked to confirm some information he no longer remembered precisely. "I may have signed something," he said in the 1994 interview. "I don't remember it clearly." That gap in memory, that fogged moment, it appears in other accounts too, and once you notice it, you begin to see it everywhere. Let me tell you what the researchers found in Amarillo. In 1994, a journalist named Patricia Greer, working on what she described as a routine archive survey for a regional history project, located a cardboard storage box at a facility on South Taylor Street in Amarillo that contained, among other materials, a collection of handwritten notes, 2 partial letters, and a 63-page typed document that bore no author attribution, but appeared to be a compiled account of events in and around Roswell in July 1947, from the perspective of multiple unnamed witnesses. Earl Hicks's account occupied pages 41 through 57 of that document. The document had no chain of custody, no indication of who compiled it, when it was typed, or how it came to be in that storage facility. The facility's record showed the box had been checked in sometime in the late 1960s under a business name that no longer appeared in any New Mexico or Texas commercial registry. The person who signed for it, or the name on the receipt, was listed only as H. Reeves' agent. No such person has been identified. This raises a simple but important question. Who was preserving this account, and why? If the Hicks testimony was suppressed, if it was, as the account implies, effectively erased from the official record, then the existence of this document suggests someone somewhere was maintaining a parallel record, not a government record, not an authorized archive, something informal, clandestine, assembled in the margins of history by someone who understood that the official version was incomplete. The pattern here is not unique to Roswell. Researchers familiar with similar events in the 1940s and 50s, and I want to be careful here not to overstate the case, but researchers familiar with this period have noted a recurring structure. Witness, encounter, official retrieval of evidence, witness silence, and then, years or decades later, the emergence of a preserved account from an unverifiable source. The mechanism by which these accounts survive is never clear. They simply appear. But there's something else in the Amarillo document that goes beyond Hicks's testimony. Something that, if accurate, changes the shape of the story considerably. On pages 12 through 19 before the Hicks section, there is an account attributed to a woman identified only as Mrs. E. C., a Roswell resident who worked at the time as a telephone operator at the local exchange. Her account describes in careful and mundane detail the events of July 7th and 8th as they passed through her switchboard. She logged from memory an unusual volume of calls between Roswell Army Airfield and a number she didn't recognize, a long-distance number with an exchange she later tried to trace and could not. She also logged something else. On the morning of July 8th before 7 a.m. she connected a call from RAAF to a rural line that she identified from the exchange prefix as serving the area of the Foster Ranch. The call lasted 4 minutes, and this is where the account becomes, as she put it, something I've thought about for 40 years because Earl Hicks said no one called him. He had no telephone at the ranch house. He had made no calls. The nearest telephone 12 miles away at a neighbouring property was not used. And yet, according to Mrs. E.C., a call was placed from the airbase to a line in that rural exchange on the morning the two uniformed men arrived. Someone in that region was contacted before the men arrived. Who? About what? For what purpose? And here's where the strangeness becomes truly difficult to dismiss. The neighbouring property, the one with the nearest working telephone, was owned in 1947 by a man named Gerald Foss. Foss, according to local records, had previously served as a civilian contractor for the Army Air Forces during the war. His contract, which was located through a partial FOIA request in 2001 by independent researcher Alan Drury of Santa Fe, covered an unspecified communications-related service in the Chavez County area. The contract was marked with a classification designation that had been redacted. Gerald Foss, a contractor with redacted communication duties 12 miles from Earl Hicks, called on the morning of July 8th. The coincidences accumulate. They accumulate with a precision that begins to feel less like coincidence and more like architecture. Let me be clear about something. No one has seen the photographs. The photographs, if they existed, and I believe they existed, have not surfaced in any archive, any leak, any disclosure. They are simply gone. We have Hicks's description of what he photographed. We have his account of the bodies, the hands with extra fingers, the deliberately arranged positions. We have the detail that stayed with him longest, the one he returned to again and again in his recorded testimony. The eyes. They were closed, he said. All four of them had their eyes closed, like they were sleeping. I couldn't stop thinking that they looked like they were sleeping. A small detail, an almost unbearably small detail. But I want you to consider what it means if it's accurate. If these beings, these extraterrestrials, whatever they were found with eyes closed, arranged with apparent deliberateness, placed in positions suggesting either post-mortem care or a last posture of repose. It doesn't suggest an accident. It doesn't suggest a crash in the pure mechanical sense. It suggests a scene that someone or something had arranged, or that these beings had arranged for themselves. Why would that matter? Why would that particular detail require the suppression of 12 photographic frames? Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the photographs were confiscated for entirely mundane reasons of national security, and the content was incidental to the method. But there's another possibility, one that the official explanation collapses trying to accommodate. That the photographs showed something so specifically, so undeniably non-human, that no amount of framing or narrative control could contain them once they were in circulation. A weather balloon doesn't have eyes that close. A Project Mogul device doesn't have hands with extra fingers, and 12 photographs taken at close range with a medium format camera by a man who was close enough to touch them. His words would not have been 12 photographs of instrument wreckage. What I keep returning to is the infrastructure of this suppression, because that's what it requires. Not a cover-up in the Hollywood sense, not a dramatic erasure involving black helicopters and midnight meetings. Something quieter, something almost bureaucratic. The identification of peripheral witnesses, the mapping of who had been where, the targeting of physical evidence before it could be processed. Consider what that requires logistically. On July 6th, a ranch hand in a remote corner of New Mexico takes photographs with a personal camera. He tells no one. He goes nowhere. And within 36 hours, uniformed men arrive at his door knowing what camera he owns and what he photographed. In 1947, without digital surveillance, without the technical apparatus we now associate with intelligence operations. So how? Aerial observation, potentially. The recovery operation at the main site was already in progress and presumably included surveillance of the surrounding area. Were there observers watching who saw him on the north pasture that morning? Possibly. But that raises its own question. If someone observed him from the air, why was that observation not logged? Why does no flight record from RAAF for July 6th mention an observer aircraft over the north pasture? A partial release of base records in 2003, records covering July 1947, specifically contains flight logs for that period that researchers have noted are conspicuously sparse for the critical 2-day window. The records that exist are normal, the records that should exist are missing. And the pattern of what's absent is, in itself, a kind of evidence. The evidence suggests something larger than a single witness management incident. It suggests a system, a responsive, adaptable system that could identify peripheral witnesses, locate them without their knowledge, and retrieve their evidence cleanly, politely, and without creating a paper trail that anyone has yet been able to fully reconstruct. Once you understand the scope of that system, once you see it, you can't look away. Because if it was deployed for Earl Hicks, a single ranch hand with a personal camera, 12 photographs deep into a Sunday morning encounter, how many other Earl Hickses were there? How many other cameras? How many other accounts now sit in unmarked boxes, in storage facilities, in cities we haven't searched yet? How many accounts were never preserved at all? In October of 1994, 5 months after the Amarillo document was located, Patricia Greer travelled to a retirement community in Tucumcari, New Mexico, where Earl Hicks was then living. He was 81 years old. He had never spoken publicly about any of this. Greer spent 2 days with him. The recorded portion of those conversations runs to approximately 4 hours, transcribed in a document she later shared with a small number of researchers but never published publicly. She was, by her own account, unprepared for what she found. Not because he was dramatic, because he was the opposite. He was calm, measured. He described what he had seen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the account internally for 47 years and arrived at a version scrubbed of embellishment, stripped of interpretation, reduced to what he was certain of and nothing more. He didn't claim to know what the beings were. He didn't claim to understand what had happened. He simply described what he saw. The debris, the material, the bodies, the eyes. And then he said something that Greer noted as the moment that stayed with her longest. She asked him if he regretted giving up the camera. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've thought about that question for a long time, but here's what I keep coming back to. Those pictures, if they were real, if they came out the way I think they came out, they would have shown something nobody was ready to see. Maybe nobody's ready to see it now. Maybe the problem isn't that the pictures were taken. The problem is that we'd have to do something about it." He died in March of 1997, 50 years almost to the month after that Sunday morning on the North Pasture. His account remains unpublished. His photographs remain missing. The Amarillo document is held by a private researcher whose identity Greer has declined to disclose publicly. So let me leave you here in this unresolved place. Because the mystery of Earl Hicks is not ultimately about a camera or 12 frames of exposed film or two polite men in uniforms who arrived before they should have been able to. Those things matter. The logistics matter. The impossibility of the timing matters. But what haunts me, what I keep returning to in the quiet, is the wider question. What knowledge have we lost? Not suppressed, not hidden in some vault, but lost permanently because the mechanism of suppression is so complete that we can't even measure the edges of what's missing. How many photographs were taken in those days in July 1947 by people who were simply in the wrong place with a camera? How many rolls of film were removed from small-town camera shops before they could be developed? How many handwritten accounts, how many letters, how many conversations that should have become testimony were quietly redirected before they could become part of the record? If even one ranch hand in a remote pasture was identified, located and visited within 36 hours, what does that tell us about the scale of the operation? What does it tell us about the priority level of the containment? And here is the question that I find genuinely impossible to resolve. If the photographs had survived, if those 12 frames had been developed and printed and circulated, what would we have done with what they showed? Would it have changed anything? Would the knowledge of what those beings looked like, sleeping, arranged, hands with too many fingers, would that have altered the trajectory of the decades that followed? Would we have made different choices, asked different questions, pursued different understandings, or would we have done exactly what we did anyway, built a consensus around the official story, retrofitted the evidence to match the conclusion, and quietly filed away the anomalies that didn't fit? Maybe the photographs exist in an archive somewhere. Maybe someone decades ago made copies before they disappeared. Maybe there is a box in a storage facility in a city I haven't thought to search yet that contains what Earl Hicks documented on a Sunday morning in the New Mexico desert before the world got to it first. Maybe. But maybe the more honest question is this. We don't know what we don't know we've lost, and that absence, unmeasured, unmapped, sitting in the margins of the official record, is itself the most troubling evidence of all. Not the photographs, the fact that we can't find them, the fact that we may